Hello everybody. So here we are back again, and today we're going to start looking at the second of our time periods for medicine through time, or health and the people. And the second one, it kind of builds on what we finished with last time we spoke. I'm just going to turn this slightly. Which is, we talked about the plague, and we talked about the effect of the plague and the disruptive effect of the plague on society. And I think we spoke about the feudal system, which was the sort of pyramid structure of society, with the king at the top and the barons and the knights, and then the peasants at the bottom. And we talked about how the plague had kind of disrupted that. Well, that's all part, that disruption, which began in the 14th century, paves the way for the kind of social change that we see in the Renaissance. Which is linked with also a declining power of the church during the Renaissance period, largely due to the fact that the Catholic Church split into two, and we get the rise of the Protestant Church. So therefore, the church is kind of, its power is undermined. It's not as able to control the flow of information in society, and we see different social classes rising up in sort of rebellion against their king, and here's poor old Charles I getting his head chopped off. And what that does is it kind of removes some of the restrictions on what people were able to do in society, which therefore has an effect on creating more social change and more scientific development and scientific progress throughout the Renaissance and early modern Britain. Okay, as I've said in the class, we've really got two time periods here thrown into one. And there are sort of some differences between them. If you looked at the way people dressed in the Renaissance, it was quite flamboyant like that, and it was very much sort of militaristic. Whereas by the time we get to early modern Britain, we've got something much more like a sort of civil culture develops and different styles of dress. So if you looked at people from those two time periods, you say, oh, well, they're two definitely different time periods. But the exam board has put the two together and talked about them being sort of early modern Britain and the beginnings of change, the start of scientific development after the period of the Middle Ages. Just a word on that whilst we're talking about the Middle Ages. It's important to, well, it's not important, but it's helpful to kind of think where that name came from. And that name, Middle Ages, came from people in the Renaissance. People during this second period looked back on history. They, as we'll see in a minute, looked back at the ancient world and the way that the ancient world worked, and they considered themselves more in tune with some of the social and scientific developments of the ancient world, and so they kind of spotted that there was this bit in the middle, and they called that the Middle Ages. So that helps us to just remember, as a kind of a way of kind of thinking about it, that the Renaissance here, we're talking about a rediscovery of the ancient world, and even they were aware that there'd been this gap in the middle where there hadn't been much progress or social change or scientific development, and they called that the middle bit, or the Middle Ages, between themselves and the ancient world, which they felt more in common with. Okay, so more on that to come. So what we then need to start thinking about is what the Renaissance was, what was different about it, what was new about it, and then we might get as far today as talking about three of the kind of key figures of the Renaissance period. This period of time has four key figures, but we would put Edward Jenner in the early modern period, the second half of this particular time period, okay? But during the first half, which we've called the Renaissance, we've got three main figures that we kind of need to be familiar with, okay? But if we start with kind of thinking about what the Renaissance was, we start with the word itself, and Renaissance, the nay bit, the Rene bit, that nay, that relates to birth, okay? So neonatal means, babies before they're born. Neonatal, that nay bit is the birth bit, okay, from Latin. So Renaissance just means rebirth. It's the time of rebirth. And we need to then think, well, what was actually being reborn? And what was being reborn during the Renaissance was a rebirth of learning, of science, of development, and of progress, okay? And that came about because of a number of factors coming together. The first one being the plague, the dislocation in society that the plague had caused. A second one being the breakdown of the church, the fact that people were, or certain groups in society were more willing to criticize the Catholic Church and then rise up against it and establish their own separate church, not following the authority of the Pope. And the third factor was a rediscovery of the techniques used in scientific research and development from the ancient world. Okay, we've talked about Galen and Hippocrates during the Middle Ages, but I think I did say in one of the videos that in the Middle Ages they kind of accepted the outcomes of Roman and Greek, which is what we're talking about, Greek and Roman science, without really using the same techniques. Because remember, in the Middle Ages, if any question was important, it would have been answered in the Bible. So we're not asking questions. And science and progress, science particularly, revolves around the development of the scientific method, and the scientific method starts with questions, asking why is the world the way it is? Why do I see this evidence in front of me? What has caused that to be? And that question of why then leads on through the scientific method through to coming up with theories, then designing experiments to test those theories, then observing the outcomes of those experiments, and from that then developing new theories. So science rolls on through that cycle. And it can be argued that scientific progress and development that we have in our world now is still just the rolling ball of science going through that process. Theory, test that theory through an experiment, observe the outcomes of that experiment, come up with another theory, test that theory through an experiment, observe the outcomes of that experiment, come up with another theory. And every time, as that cycle goes on, science gets closer and closer to what we might think of as objective reality. Okay? Human beings can perceive the world through our senses, but there is a whole sort of variety of the universe that we are unable to sense. Radio waves, for example, wireless Wi-Fi signals that you're probably watching this video over. We can't sense them with our bodies. But what scientists have done is, get closer and closer to an understanding of the parts of the universe that we can't directly observe. So we can observe, for instance, visible light, but we know that visible light is just part of a much wider electromagnetic spectrum of radio waves, the vast majority of which we have no ability to detect. Okay, we can only detect visible light because visible light doesn't go through objects. Therefore, our ancestors had a biological advantage by being able to detect the light that bounces off other things. Most radio waves don't bounce off other things; they go through them. Like radio waves, like TV signals and things, just go through buildings. So there's no point in us having evolved to observe them. So there's a whole areas of the universe that we can't observe, the very small, the very big. So what we have to do is we have to design ways using technologies and technological solutions that can turn those invisible aspects of the universe and change them into something we can see. So for instance, night vision goggles. We can't see that light, but we put night vision goggles on. They can see the infrared radiation from the world around us that we can't see. And the night vision goggles detect that and turn it into visible light and fire that light into the eyes of the person who's wearing the goggles. So therefore, they can see that part of the universe. Okay? So science is getting closer and closer to a reality. But every time they do that, you're making a new theory. That's not to say that your theory isn't fact. It's just that it's provisional. It's part way to a full understanding of the universe. That's the scientific method. And that's what was used by Galen and Hippocrates to some extent, and ancient Greek and Roman philosophers and thinkers, and what we might think of as scientists, certainly engineers, people like Vitruvius, who observed the world around them and built theories on those observations, and then ultimately could test those theories and refine them and get closer. That process was going on through the ancient world, but when the Roman Empire collapsed and you get the rise of Christianity and superstition and religion, you get a move away from observation of the physical world, because the Bible has replaced that observation as an understanding of the world. So therefore, once the Bible's written, there's no further development based on that scientific method. So that's why Galen and Hippocrates, their ideas didn't develop any further during the Middle Ages, because instead of carrying on with the process of getting closer and closer and closer to actually knowing what causes disease or actually knowing what the universe is really made of, that process stalled and stopped from about, you might say 400 AD to 1450, when the Renaissance began. Okay, so you've got about 1,000 years there of no further development and no getting closer and closer and closer to what reality really is. Okay, so that's why Hippocrates and Galen were taken on during the Middle Ages as being fact and reality, and their ideas weren't developed any further. But at the end of the Middle Ages, by definition, because it caused the end of the Middle Ages, you've got this kind of breakdown in the control of the church. You've got this breakdown in sort of social structures because of the plague, and you've got this kind of rediscovery of not just the reality, the conclusions of the ancient Roman authors, but also their methods. I think we've spoken in class about the fall of Constantinople and the monks leaving Constantinople and coming to Europe and bringing with them their documents, their ancient texts that they'd kept for 1,000 years in the monasteries of Byzantium in the Middle East, in Constantinople. And they arrived back in Italy bringing with them those documents, and there was already a culture in Italy waiting and ready to take some understanding from those ancient texts. A culture really personified by the author of this picture here, which is Leonardo da Vinci. So he's a really good example of an Italian thinker, writer, philosopher, artist, scientist, who was already in a state of mind that was ready to take on board the ideas that were coming out of Constantinople and Byzantium and were being brought over by the monks. That idea of beginning with questions, okay? And that's what's different about the Renaissance, okay? So it's a rediscovery of the ancient world and a rediscovery of the methods used by Galen and Hippocrates, not just their conclusions, okay? What this led to during the Renaissance, and this is kind of the things we're going to see much more of, is a great outpouring of scientific and technological ideas that are going to change the face of medicine. Because unlike looking in the Bible for answers or going to God for answers, or simply saying, well, we can't really ask questions that we don't have answers to, instead you've got the rise of the beginnings of people who are asking questions, and they are then developing ways of answering those questions, and they're observing the answers that they're getting, and that's obviously using the scientific method. Okay, that's leading to huge technological progress, not just in medicine, but right across all different aspects of society. So, and they obviously have an impact on medicine. So, for example, we've got the first printing press developed by William Caxton. We've got the microscope by Leeuwenhoek, Dutch scientist. We've got lots of new ways of looking at the world. We've got telescopes. We've got Copernican thinking about the Earth going around the sun. We've got Leonardo da Vinci and his interrogation of what makes up the human body. Originally, or partly done in order to help his artistic drawings to make them more lifelike, more realistic. And so that's happening during the Renaissance, and it's leading to more and more development. What that development is doing is it's beginning to, because it has that kind of feedback, the more questions you ask, the more theories you come up with, the more experiments you have, the more theories you come up with, the more questions you ask, etc., etc. So there's more and more questioning of the works of the ancient historians, the works of the ancient scientists like Galen and Hippocrates. So although they're using the techniques of Galen and Hippocrates, what they're doing is they're using those to question the conclusions that Galen and Hippocrates come up with, which you could imagine if there hadn't been a Middle Ages, they would have been questioned. Earlier, Galen and Hippocrates were presumably in the process of questioning their own conclusions. That's why Galen was dissecting pigs, because he didn't have a full understanding. He'd come up with theory, he then did some and he was in the middle of already questioning his own kind of ideas, and then the other Romans coming along would have been questioning that, but it stalled. So in the Renaissance, they begin to question Galen's conclusions, and using the same kind of scientific method that Galen would have used to actually find out, get closer to reality and closer to the truth than Galen had got. So we've got people casting doubts on Galen's observations. We've got people realizing that Galen was wrong, perhaps in the circulation of the blood, or the idea of what happens to the blood in the body. Galen didn't believe it circulated. Wrong in his kind of anatomical descriptions. So that whole thing where we've said before of like the medieval dissections and if the body doesn't match Galen, then it's the body that's wrong. Well, that goes during the Renaissance, because we're now able to, or we've got a more questioning approach that allows us to question whether Galen was right. We can also use new technology like the microscope in order to look deeper and deeper into the body, to question again, the kind of descriptions of the body that have come to us from the ancient world. And we've got things like the printing press, which is allowing further communication, spreading of ideas, which is only going to kind of stimulate more and more investigation. Okay? So that then leads us on to, this is such a huge change in society that we shouldn't underestimate how different the world is after the Renaissance than how it was during the Middle Ages. If an alien came down to Earth in 50,000 years and dug up evidence of our society, they may well say that we live as inheritors of the Roman Empire. There was this kind of 1,000-year blip, which didn't really matter. We basically are still using a development of the scientific method that was created by the Greeks and the Romans. And the Middle Ages didn't contribute to that in the same way that the Renaissance did. So it's a fundamental change and a fundamental development in the sort of world history, if you like, certainly in Europe. Okay, I think we've said before that in the Muslim world, they still had access to the works of Aristotle and understood much more about the scientific process, and certainly relied more heavily on observation of reality rather than ancient texts that the Christian world used. So in the Muslim world, things are slightly different, and obviously further afield in the world, there's other processes in play. But in Europe, and certainly in Britain, it's the Renaissance and the Reformation, which is the division of the church, that has such an impact on our world. Okay, this leads to, let's just quickly kind of mention them. We may well come back to them in the future, but three main medical sort of pioneers that we can sort of reference and talk about in the Renaissance. The first one of those is Andreas Vesalius, and Vesalius was he was an anatomist. So Vesalius's approach was to dissect bodies in a way that hadn't been possible so much during the Middle Ages, partly because of the control of the church on what happened to human bodies after death. With the decline in church control, with the church not so able to condemn people who investigated and asked questions, Vesalius took upon himself to dissect human bodies and to draw accurate representations of what he saw. Okay, so Vesalius wrote a book, I think we've got the name there, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, which means the makeup of the human body. And in that book, which was an amazingly illustrated book with pictures of what looked to us kind of like zombie type characters, if you like, of like the kind of skin taken off the body and showing the sinews and the muscles and the bone structure of the human body. Vesalius made great use of obviously the printing press and engravings, new technological developments to allow him to share and to spread the findings of his anatomy. He worked in Italy, in Padua, in Italy, where he was a professor of surgery and anatomy. And he began the process, if you like, of kind of realistic life drawings of the human body. So Vesalius was, a key important thinker in the Renaissance. Wouldn't have been able to do that work and to share his ideas as widely had he lived during the Middle Ages. Okay. Now, at a similar time, we've got down here, we've got Ambrose Pare. And Pare, so, is a really good example of kind of warfare helping medicine move on, because Pare was an army surgeon, and he was working alongside soldiers in the French army, and he studied in Paris, trained at the Hotel de Dieu hospital in Paris before becoming a surgeon in the army. And as a surgeon in the army, he was responsible, obviously, for amputations of injured limbs, etc. And Pare is our first step. I don't know if you remember, we talked previously about surgery, and we talked about the barber surgeon, and we spoke about the difficulties of surgery. And we said the three main problems of surgery are pain, blood loss, and infection. Okay? And we talked about how the barber surgeons would cauterize a wound using heated plates, sort of metal plates, to cauterize and to melt the wound. What Pare does is he's working with the French army using cauterization, but he runs out of hot oil to be used for the cauterization process. So he remembers, or has kind of read, some other works of Galen, which hadn't been promoted by the church previously, that talked about the use of ligatures. Ligatures are small bits of thread, if you like. In this case, they might have been even made of catgut, which can be like long and stringy. And those small bits of thread are used to tie up the veins after an amputation. And we still use this method now. So after an amputation in the French, in the French army, Pare didn't have the oil to use for cauterization, so he developed and redeveloped, if you like, rediscovered the use of ligatures to tie up the veins of injured soldiers, and in that way to prevent blood loss. Now, that's going to be really, really helpful, obviously, as in terms of addressing one of the three main problems of surgery. However, it does have some drawbacks. If you've just chopped off somebody's arm and you're in a battlefield situation, I suppose, in a field hospital just behind a battlefront, you've chopped off somebody's arm, you've got no anaesthetic, that person is going to be writhing in agony. That person is going to be very, very quickly dying of, very soon dying of blood loss or shock from blood loss, and obviously infection is going to become embedded in their wound. And here you are as a soldier, as an army surgeon, trying to carefully and delicately spend half an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever, tying up the bleeding veins and arteries of this sort of stump. The practical applications of that, are going to become much more important when we do have access to anaesthetic. These three things kind of go together, of pain, blood loss, and infection. They kind of go together, and you can't solve one without the others. Pare is dealing with ligatures, but the impact of his work is going to take some time, because they go hand in hand with kind of a calmer, more slow and deliberate surgery that's probably not possible when you've got a man who or a woman who you're kind of amputating and they've got no anaesthetic. You need to get it over with quickly. They're going to be writhing around, they're going to be shouting. It's very hard to then sew things up. So Pare is another kind of really important development in the Renaissance, and once again he shows the importance of communication systems developed in the Renaissance, because he publishes a book. This one's called Les Ouvres in 1575, and that gets published across Europe, spreading his ideas and sharing his ideas with the rest of the world. So we've got Vesalius, Pare, and the third important person from the Renaissance is William Harvey. William Harvey's up here. Okay, and William Harvey, again, a classic example of somebody asking questions, because what William Harvey is doing is he's asking questions of Galen's assertion that the body creates blood in the liver and then burns it up in the extremities, in the limbs, in the hands and the feet. Okay, that was Galen's idea, or Galen, when he dissected his pigs, he found a heart there, he found a liver. He knows that blood goes through the liver, and he thought that, or he knows that the liver has something to do with blood. He thought that the liver was creating the blood for the heart then to pump out to the arms and legs where the blood was burnt up. Okay, and Harvey questioned this, and he questioned it, which is fine, people can question, but in this case what Harvey did was he came up with a series of observations and experiments to prove that Galen was wrong, okay, in a way that hadn't been proved before. Okay, so I would suggest there's 3 main ways in which Harvey proved Galen wrong. Okay, the first one is a simple mathematical sort of experiment. What Harvey did was he took a body, he drained the blood from it at point of death, obviously after it's died, and he weighed the blood, and he worked out that if you were to be constantly making and then burning up that blood, he worked out the size of the meals that you would have to have, the amount of matter, physical matter you would have to take into your body just to create that amount of blood. So however many pints of blood a human has, that he took that out, weighed it, worked out the mass of it, and worked out what size meals you would have to have if that amount of matter was constantly being created and used up in your body. And obviously the amount of meals you would have far exceeded the amount of meals that he could observe people having around him, the amount of weight that they were taking in terms of their meals. And that simple thought experiment, logical kind of experiment, if you like, led him to realize that something different must be going on, that some of this must be being recycled in some way. Okay, the second way to the second sort of form of this was that Harvey used amphibians. Now, amphibians are cold-blooded, and their blood therefore moves much more slowly around the body, and it was more easy for him then to see the blood and to observe the blood moving through the amphibian's body in a way that then he could kind of extrapolate out to the human body and say, well, I can see this in this animal. Can I then see similar kind of structures and similar elements in the body of humans as well? Okay, so we've got weighing the amount of blood, we've got the use of amphibians, and then the third method is the one we can see here, which is by actually looking at the structures inside the human body. Now, one of the drawbacks of the theory of blood circulation, so this is what Harvey came up with, the idea that blood is circulated by the heart, it kind of goes out from the heart to the rest of the body and then comes back into the heart. That gives us our 4 chambers of the heart. 2 of them are to push it out and 2 to pull it in. That might not be quite true, but there's 4 chambers, and the blood pumps around and circulates through the heart, okay, and goes from the heart at pressure, okay, through what we now call arteries. So the blood at an artery that's going through an artery is under pressure, so it's pressurized. You get blood pressure readings, can't you? Goes out to the extremities, hands and feet, goes through extremely small what we call capillaries, and then is deoxygenated, so the oxygen in the blood is used up through muscles and movement, etc., through all kinds of physical processes. And then that deoxygenated blood, there's no oxygen, less oxygen in it, it then goes from the capillaries into the veins, and then from the veins back to the heart, roughly, via the lungs, etc. Okay, so not included the lungs in all that, but basically we've got arteries, capillaries, and veins. Arteries take the blood out under pressure through the capillaries, where the oxygen is taken out of it, and then the veins go take it back. The problem that Harvey had is that the capillaries are so small, the connections between arteries that carry the blood out and veins that bring it back, the connection between those is the capillaries, and they're so small he couldn't observe them, couldn't see them. So he couldn't actually make that kind of connection between the two observable parts of the system, the arteries and the veins. And it took many years for, I'm just trying to find it, if it's got it on here. But yeah, it took many years for Harvey to actually be proved right. And that came about through the process of kind of better and better microscopes and a better understanding of the structure of the body. So he looked at the human body, he saw arteries, saw veins, couldn't see the capillaries, but he was able to prove that arteries and veins ran in different directions. Okay? And he proved that through the discovery of the valves within arteries and veins, the valves that force the blood only to flow in one way, and therefore, he knows that the blood is flowing out through arteries and back through veins, because the valves inside those tubes, if you like, are stopping the blood from going in the other direction. A famous experiment of Harvey's, you can do this yourself if you wish. You find a vein, you can pump it up, and you can put your finger just to one side of one of those valves. You can push the blood out, and the blood, if you push it back past one of those, or push it up past one of those valves towards your heart, if you like, the blood can't get back into that emptied part of the vein until you, I'm doing it on this way, that's it, until you release the other part of your the other finger that's blocking the valve that's coming from the other direction. The best, easiest way to do it is on your hand. So you can put it on there, empty the thing, and then it fills up again. That's quite good, actually. There it is. I've got a gap, and it's filled up. Because what I'm doing is I'm blocking the vein. I'm pushing. I'll do it again. Blocking the vein. I'm pushing the blood past that next valve. Can't go through, and then I do that, and it can then come through. That proves that the blood flows in that particular direction. Well, if Galen's right, why would my blood be going back from my fingers to my heart? Okay, that's what Harvey has proved, and he's proved it through the use of the scientific method. Comes up with a theory. If blood circulates, then this should be the case. If blood circulates, then there should be some valves to help it get back to the heart, because it's got to come up from your legs. Otherwise, your blood would be pooling in your feet. If it circulates, it has to have these valves. That's my theory. I'm going to test that theory. I'm going to find some veins. I'm going to look for those valves. Oh, look, there it is. I've found the valves. I've observed the results of my experiment, and that's taken me closer to the truth, which is that veins and arteries have valves in them. Okay? So 3 different ways in which Harvey is using scientific method to question Galen. Okay? To question the conclusions that Galen came out with. But he's just like the other people in the Renaissance who are questioning the ancient world. They're actually the outcomes of the ancient world and the science done in the ancient world. They're using the methods of those scientists from the ancient world to question the conclusions of those scientists. Okay, so it's not a rejection of Galen's world, it's actually kind of using Galen in a different way, using his methods of observation to call into question the conclusions that he came up with. Now, one more thing just to say about these 3 people. And if we look at Vesalius, we find him drawing anatomy, publishing books, rich people buying those books, thinking, oh, that's really interesting. So what? With Pare, we've got him inventing ligatures, writing a book, sharing his ideas with other army surgeons. Problem is you can't use his development very widely because of the pain of surgery. So what? Harvey developing theory of blood circulation, that understanding. So what? Okay, all 3 of those major thinkers of the Renaissance are coming up with some brilliant science and some great observations. But what's changing? What's actually changing for ordinary people in the Renaissance in terms of the treatment that they're getting? I think we could argue that we've got 3 people there who are coming up with new ideas and new developments, but what difference is it actually making to the lives of, you know, your poor villager who's still going to a wise woman, who's still seeing the lady of the house in order to get some you know, herbal remedies, who's still kind of having to kind of go for bleeding at the barber surgeons, and you know, the barber surgeon knows about Pare, but he can't use his ideas because he's got to get this guy kind of healed up pretty quick while he's screaming in pain, so can't do ligatures, gonna have to cauterize him. What difference is it actually making? It's not making a difference to the treatments of ordinary people. The Renaissance is a time of, you know, great scientific kind of progress in terms of theory and understanding, but what difference is it really making for ordinary people in the way they're being treated, you know, in a medical sense? And I think we could pretty much say that, you know, there's not a great deal. On our next video, we'll have a little look at Sydenham, who was making some changes, and think about surgery in the Renaissance. But again, we'll find, you know, not a great deal of difference, despite this huge growth in questioning, scientific method, use of theory, experiments, and a great understanding of what's going on medically. Not a huge amount of change in terms of treatments for ordinary people. Okay, thank you for your time. See you all soon. Bye-bye.